Hello, welcome to my presentation. I would like to thank Dindiç for his invitation for me to be a part of Cultural Heritage series. My presentation will be about legislative aspects of heritage conservation. So I would like to look firstly into the international agenda in terms of legal documents of conservation, and then to see how they are reflected on our own legal documents in TRNC. So I start with looking at the dictionary meanings of conservation, or koruma in Turkish, where these words are actually meaning hiding something or protecting something from injuries or decay, whereas in fact actually the activity of conservation includes, it's a more dynamic process where you have to protect, but at the same time there is contemporary needs and changing needs of inhabitants. So here I think it's important to look at the legislative aspects of conservation because it gives us an idea of how we actually look at the heritage in general and heritage conservation as well. So of course the field of conservation is very wide and it is very, actually it's a big discipline. However, the legislative aspects are also important because they're kind of regulating all the implementation and other aspects of these processes. So what I did here is firstly to look in general to the international platforms to see how it is all developing through time, actually, to see the important concepts or highlights in that field, and then to see how it is adapted into our country conditions or how we see it in the current regulations. So I will go through the beginnings of the conservation idea and its development through 20th century, and then try to see the developments in that conceptual manner. So from 19th century onwards, actually, these ideas of William Morris or John Ruskin has been dominating this agenda. And then there are too many actually documents, more than the ones I stated here, which are mostly accepted internationally, especially there is the UNESCO Convention, which has been signed by more than 180 countries all around the world. So to see actually what is discussed or highlighted or emphasized in these documents can give an idea of, this list is chronological list here, so it can give an idea of the ideas discussed under heritage conservation topics. So I try to group them actually in a chronological order because when we examine them, for example, starting with Athens Charter or Venice Charter, you can see some some keywords maybe or key concepts that are repeating. For example, at the beginning in 1900s, 1930s, we see that there was a shift which was emphasized that we should conserve objects with their settings, or we should conserve monuments together with their surroundings. So it's not enough to conserve monuments, but there was a shift that this should be done together with its close surroundings. And then in the following years, starting with the acceptance of UNESCO Convention in 1975, and later on, we see concepts like World Heritage or common heritage, or that heritage belongs to the whole humanity. Concept has been emphasized, so that the World Heritage List formulated, and that the responsibility is not just for one country, but it's the whole humanity to somehow conserve and protect this historic heritage aspects. So that was one of the highlights of this period, in addition to advising on financial aspects of conservation, how to create funding for conservation, and these kind of concepts. And when we look at more recent documents on conservation, from 2000 onwards, we see that some new concepts are included into the heritage conservation topics, which are things like intangible heritage. For example, the dialectics of special communities should be also protected. In addition to the 20th century architecture and industrial heritage should also be protected. And in the more recent documents, we see that public welfare or well-being issues are also being included into heritage conservation processes, that they should be new kind of highlights within this discipline. So when you're conserving a place, how to conserve it with the genius loci, or the spirit of place, how the authenticity aspects should be expanded, and concepts such as cultural landscape and natural landscape that should be included within these processes have been emphasized. So when we look at the development of conservation thoughts or discipline, we see that firstly the subject has been shifted from monuments or objects into a wider scale, into urban textures. And then we see that in the international legal documents, we see that emphasis has been changed, because now that we are emphasizing common heritage or universal heritage. And finally, in the more recent documents, we see that there are new highlights in this agenda, such as the well-being or quality of life aspects of heritage conservation. So this is how it all developed, actually. So when we compare these dates with the Cyprus history, we see that in 1930s, Cyprus was under British colonial period. There was a law of actually antiques, and then it turned into Antiquities Law in 1930s, actually. And then we know that in 1975 there were Turkish Federated State of Cyprus, and there was a new law of ancient monuments, which was enacted during that period. And then when we come to the present, currently we have the law of ancient monuments, which was enacted in 1994, and it was revised many times last year also, I think. So, so what I try to do is to see how the law was developed, and also to look at actually the current law to see how much of these international concerns were actually discussed here in this law. So there were no laws or legislation during the Ottoman period. However, we know that there were a kind of indirect conservation. Somehow some buildings were reused, adapted, and came up to today, actually. And during the British period is where the first laws on heritage conservation were enacted. Later on, Cyprus Republic period or the following years, we see that the same law was kind of revised, but not much changes has been done on it. So actually British period is one of the most important periods in Cyprus history in terms of legislation as well, and heritage conservation as well. So we see the first legal documents on conservation, and there were also special laws for special historic areas, such as the law of Famagusta, or for certain urban quarters, such as in Nicosia or Kyrenia. So in 1905, actually, first law was enacted, and then in 1935, Antiquities Law was enacted during British period, and it was amended in 49 and 59. Here we see that first time many monumental buildings and some examples of civil architecture were listed. So they were advising listing, but all the monuments that were listed were belong to the period earlier than 1700s. So additionally, there were some laws which can be discussed separately, such as Famagusta Improvement Law, where the heights of buildings were restricted. However, there were actually some implementations on widening the streets, where some loss of historic textures were resulted in that sense. In 1975 and 1994, the law of ancient monuments was enacted instead of Antiquities Law, and this law is still today current. And here we see some grading of conservation areas. In 1994, there was Ancient Monuments Fund was established within this law, which was later on dismissed in 2017, last year actually. And there is also Supreme Council of Immovable Antiquities and Monuments, which we call shortly IEK or Anıtlar Yüksek Kurulu. This was established according to this law. So there are other laws as well, of course. However, in this presentation today, the focus will be on the law of ancient monuments. However, we have to mention during the British period, the Streets and Buildings Regulation law was also enacted, and it has been effective on historic urban quarters as well, especially widening of some streets. Here you can see the Nicosia Wall City entrance. So at the same time, first laws were enacted during the British period, but also there were some considerable laws in terms of historic environment as well. Also, we know that in Famagusta, the city walls were pierced during the British period. So So the height restriction, according to this law, was, I think, important as well. So when we come to the current TRNC constitution, there are 4 sections related to heritage conservation, especially section 39, protection of historical, cultural and natural values is important, and the laws are regulated according to the constitution, although it, of course, it's not only the law of ancient monuments. Actually, there are many laws which are directly or indirectly affecting heritage conservation, such as the town planning law, law of wakfs, for example, because they own a considerable amount of monuments in the historic areas. But like I said, today I will focus on the law of ancient monuments. Also, in terms of organization, there are many like authorities involved within the process. In addition to Department of Ancient Monuments and Museums, there is Department of Town Planning, Foundation of FCAF, and many authorities involved within the heritage conservation area. So we know that there are some proposals on the law as well, such as the proposal on the changing members of the Supreme Council of Immovable Antiquities and Monuments. And we know that in the last year, the Ancient Monuments Fund was dismissed. So this law, which was enacted in 1994, has been changed many times. And so on today's, so when we look at the current law right now, in terms of concepts and frequently emphasized ideas in the international regulations, we see that even the title of the law is Eski Eserler Yasası, which means the law of ancient monuments. So here, when we look at even in Turkey or in the international agenda, we see that concept of cultural and natural property, cultural heritage, or that heritage which belongs to all humanity is used instead of calling these monuments ancient monuments. So the concept, so the name of the law indicating this kind of philosophy towards conserving historic heritage. We also see in the current law natural sites as being used instead of natural and cultural landscape. And in addition to these kind of key concepts, we see that there is no mention of the 20th century architecture or industrial heritage that should be protected within this law. There is no mention of intangible heritage that should be protected, or spirit of a place or quality of life has not been mentioned within the framework of this law. So when we look at the main concepts or keywords, we see that most of them has not been mentioned. For example, the law of antiquities was enacted as Ancient Monuments Law in 1935, and since that we still use the same title. In addition to concepts like cultural and natural property and heritage that belongs to all humanity. Additionally, there's no mention of the social or economic dimensions of heritage conservation. So the development plan for conservation areas was only mentioned at one place in the law, where the scope is not really clear. Additionally, I think that the 20th century architecture and the modernism period products of architecture, ignoring them is a serious shortcoming of this law. Conservation legislation has been updated actually last year, but unfortunately not in a good way, because we lost the Monuments Fund. Additionally, in the Supreme Council of Immovable Properties, they're discussing if we should include NGOs in it or not in the agenda of Parliament today. So, actually, all these like shortcomings in the law can be seen also in the implementation and in real life as well. I believe that unfortunately the law of ancient monuments is missing many of the current concepts and highlights in this field of conservation. Thank you for listening to me.